thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to talk a little bit about Francis of Assisi. In our time, I should stress it is Francis of Assisi and not another Francis who is very well known in this world, who's the Pope Francis, who called himself after the Saint Francis of Assisi when he talked about how his election took place. And how he changed his name as a pope is supposed to do when he's elected. He said, that is how the name came into my heart. So he refers to a colleague from Latin America who mentioned the poor. And there he said, that is how the name came into my heart, Francis of Assisi. For me, he is the man of poverty, the man of peace, the man who loves and protects creation. These days, we do not have a very good relationship with creation, do we? He's the man who gives us this spirit of peace, the poor man. How I would like a church which is poor and for the poor. So he identified with a person who lived 800 years ago, and a person of whom we know he grew up in Middle Italy in this small city, Assisi. You will later on see a picture of this nice city. Pope Francis thought about this person under three headings: poverty, peace, and creation, which resonates with something we know for sure about Francis of Assisi. He wrote an impressive poem in which he evoked the Most High. God, all praise is yours, all glory, all honor, and all blessing. This is his Canticle of the Sun, in which he praises God through the nature, with the nature. And of course, this is something so important in our times when we think about what we as humans have done with our creation. We are facing the deepest crisis of creation in our times. And Pope Francis himself very often referred to Francis of Assisi to embolden a spirit of familiarity with the nature, a spirit of protecting the nature. I won't go through this entire song just to remind you. These are some words of Francis of Assisi of which we actually know they are written by Francis of Assisi. This is kind of original voice. Now, thinking more about what do we know about Francis of Assisi besides this song, this cantica, and besides his testament, his rule he gave to his brothers, then the problem arises, which I faced when writing a biography about Francis of Assisi. When now I compare my own work as a medievalist with someone who writes about, say, Immanuel Kant, who was just mentioned, about whom Professor Lee has done such a tremendous work of translating all works of Immanuel Kant, then researchers on Immanuel Kant have much more sources to reconstruct the life of Immanuel Kant, including some very peculiar late writings, and including some notes in his diary, including some notes of friends. It is almost overwhelming what you have about Immanuel Kant to reconstruct his biography. This is different in the 13th century, where you have only, let's say, 100 pages written by Francis himself. You have no note, almost no note from his lifetime, only some mentionings about how his rule was produced. And then you have a lot of biographies, which have a pinnacle in the late biography written by Saint Bonaventure, his Legenda Major and Minor, which, as you see, was written 40 years after Francis died in 1226. Bonaventure then was the general minister of the order which Francis had founded, and he found that not much was known about Francis. So the chapter of the Franciscans commissioned himself, this General Minister Bonaventure, to write a new Vita. Sorry for the typo. It's not Vita, it's Vita. So he was supposed to write a new Vita, a new biography of Francis of Assisi that would frame our understanding of Francis for centuries. But as I said, it was late, and it was predated by a good number of other biographies. Very early, Francis was canonized, so he was declared a saint by the Catholic Church in 1228. And to foster this canonization, Thomas of Celano, and a brother of his order, wrote his first Vita, his first biography, the Vita Prima, in around this time of canonization, around 1228, 29. This is actually the first biography of Francis. And if you think about this, we have an upside of this. This biography is written by someone who was part of the order, who was a friend of Francis, so he knew Francis quite well. On the other side, speaking as a historian, it is a problematic book. Just thinking about someone writes this biography to argue why Francis should be canonized. This is like, or even worse, if you think you want to reconstruct the life of someone by the obituary held by someone at a funeral. If we go to a funeral, we only will say positive things about the person who is remembered at that moment. So we will not tell those stories in which this person was a bit of awkward or maybe even mean. We would not mention this at a funeral. That is even more the case when it comes to a canonization. You will give the arguments to say, yes, this was really a saint. And then, of course, if I don't believe that there ever existed a person who was good throughout his life, that not everything is mentioned as it was historically. It also means that something is reframed to argue for the sainthood of this one. So in historical terms, this kind of biography is a problematic one. And the same is the case for all other biographies written in the following years. I will not say something about every one of those, just mentioning there were some other biographies which give some material about the biography of Francis of Assisi. And then 20 years after the life of Francis, Crescentius of Assisi, who was general minister of the Franciscans as well, called his brothers together signa et prodigia, so signs and prophecies about the most Saint Father Francis. Again, other biographies were written. Even Thomas of Celano wrote his second Vita, Vita Secunda, in this time, and even a Book of Miracles. You see, and these are not all biographies we have. We have many biographies, so you might say, already, it is like in the case of Immanuel Kant, you have a lot of material. That's right. But it is a lot of material that is biased. It is biased in a positive sense. They want to show how great, how good, how fantastic Francis was. This is great to venerate Saint Francis. It is not so great to understand him in historical terms. To give you an example of the problems that a biographer is facing, if we look at the first biography written by Thomas of Celano, then he describes young Francis as a leader of a bad gang in Assisi. He was gathering a group of young people in Assisi around him, and they tortured the city. They went through the streets, mocking other people, doing all bad things. The only thing that prepared the later career of Francis was that he was a leader figure. If we then look at Thomas of Celano, what he wrote only 20 years later, then he would write, young Francis was a saint from the beginning. That's a difference obviously. And now what you do as a historian who wants to understand what is the right thing about Francis? Was he now this mean, bad person from the beginning, or who then converted and became a saint? Or was he a saint from the beginning? Very different stories about his relation to the parents. And as we will see, I think the relation to his parents, in particular to his father, are a kind of key to understand him. So we have to understand how would we tell the story, knowing there is no real Francis. We will never get to a real Francis. He's gone. This is 800 years ago. We don't have any eyewitness whom we could ask about the real Francis. We only can approach this kind of real Francis. We can find the most likely image of Francis. And I will tell a little bit about how to do this when writing a biography. We can look at how old are the sources, as I did in this list of those many biographies. And of course, the best sources to understand the life of Francis are those few texts he wrote on his own. They help us to understand at least his mindset. And at some points, we understand a little bit about scenes of his life. Not so many there, but at least some give us insights in the course, the journey of his life. And then we can look, maybe the older source is the better. That would be the first attempt, which might not fit in any case. If you think about Thomas of Celano, who wrote another biography, a second biography, should I assume that still the older one is the better, or did he correct himself with a second biography? In this case, the younger source might be the better one. So that is a first attempt to understand how those sources work. Another one is we can look at the biases in the sources. So there is a kind of assumption from my side when writing a book that there might be some exaggerations by those authors who are Franciscans, who want to show how great their founder of their order was. So there is bias in the sources, and I have to read these sources in the sense, yeah, let's draw this bias out of the sources and trace back to what might be the material in these sources. I will give you two examples. One about a scene in the life of St. Francis, which is very famous, and of which we have sources which are less biased because they are not written by Franciscans. And then I will show an example, also quite famous, about how Franciscans would frame their biography with their biases, starting with a famous scene which is so important for our times. St. Francis talking to the Sultan, which is important, of course, in our times where we try to talk with other religions, Christians with Muslims and Jews. And so we have an example in the Middle Ages of a Christian who came to the Sultan, very often used as an example for a peaceful talk between religions in the Middle Ages. Here we have a number of sources which are not written by Franciscans. There was Jacques de Vitry, a bishop who was close to Francis when he was in Damiette in Egypt to encounter the Sultan in 1219. Jacques of Vitry was close there, and only a half a year later, he wrote a letter about this. So it's an old source. It is a source of someone who is not biased there, and the same Jacques of Vitry reported about this event in his Historia Occidentalis, a kind of chronicle, as we have two other chronicles reporting about this event. So we might come closer to this, what happened in 1219 with Francis obviously entering the camp of the Muslim leader, the Sultan, to talk to him. If we then look closer, at these sources, we can draw out of them, yes, it must have been that Francis, before entering the Sultan's camp, he was warned not to do this. And then the question of a historian is, how did it come that someone entering a camp, a Christian coming to this camp, was brought to the Sultan himself? And there I will show you a kind of example how we deal with different sources. One source says, Jacques de Vitry says, Francis shouted, "Bring me to your master," to the guardians of the camp. And then he was brought there. Another source, Jordan of Janos, says, Francis just shouted, "Sultan, Sultan." That is, of course, it's a minor question, or seemingly it's a minor question. And, but it is not a minor question insofar as if you think about someone who is a guardian of a military camp and see someone entering, what would be your first thought about them? You would bring them into jail. You would imprison them. So why was he brought to the Sultan? He must have said something that impressed those guardians. And now a kind of reasoning comes to my mind when I quote Jacques de Vitry in English, "Bring me to your master." Of course, he quotes Latin words. And now tell me who of those guardians would speak Latin? No one would. So the more reasonable, the more likely shout was that Francis just shouted, "Sultan, Sultan." That was understandable. He could shout that. That was understandable. And maybe the guardians thought he is a messenger from the Christians who brought a message to the Sultan. So they might have thought he was a spy, a deserter, or an ambassador, but they found enough reason in this shouting of "Sultan, Sultan" to bring him to the Sultan. That makes a bit of sense. And what did he do there? Did he really, as we assume nowadays, have a talk with the Sultan? In which language would he have done this again? There were some translators, of course. Did he really debate? We have so different reports. I guess what he tried was to convert the Sultan. So he had a missionary sermon, however it was translated, to the Sultan. And the reason, the next question is, why was he released from the camp? I guess that people thought he was obviously not a spy. Maybe they just thought he was weird, or at least harmless. So then he was released in the end, which means if we try to reconstruct it this way, we see every attempt nowadays to make Francis a witness of talks between religions nowadays might fall short compared to the sources, which do make this a very mundane event in the end. That's one attempt to understand or to deal with the sources. Another one is about his talks with Jesus Christ, which are, of course, leads very much into the spirituality of Francis of Assisi. And there are stories, you see it on the image on the bottom of this slide. There are stories about him talking to a crucifix in San Damiano, which is close to Assisi. And the story goes that this crucifix started talking. And you still see this crucifix in Assisi. It has been moved to another church, Santa Chiara now. And it is venerated because it was a talking crucifix. And it said to Francis, "Francis, do you not see that my house is falling into ruin? Go and repair it for me." So Jesus Christ shouted to Francis, "Go repair my house." And obviously this house was not only the church of San Damiano, which was in ruins, but it was the whole Catholic Church of that time. Very important story. And how now do we decide this happened or this happened not? There might be an easy answer for some of you. A crucifix is wooden, it would never talk. Yeah, it's a possibility to do so. If I don't want to reject any possibility of miracles in any culture, if I want to have respect against religious people who believe in this possibility, I still have some historical arguments to say I doubt if this ever happened. The first thing is we don't have this talk between Jesus Christ and St. Francis in the oldest sources. So what I said before, the age of the sources comes in. It is not in the first biography Thomas of Celano wrote. He only added it in his second biography. So it is not an old source that transfers this talk between Christ and St. Francis. That's one argument there. Another argument there is it seems like some authors, including Thomas of Celano, wanted to show throughout the biography this kind of misunderstanding of repairing the church by St. Francis. There's another layer in those biographies, but again, this understanding of repairing the church or rescuing the church comes into the play. A story also in late sources that says that Pope, who was Innocent XXX in his time, that the Pope had a dream seeing a little monk who supported the Church of the Laterans, or the papal church in this time, which was in peril to fall down, and he fostered it, he supported it, he rescued this church. And the Pope understood this monk who rescues the Church of the Lateran, he will rescue the whole Church of Christ. You see the same playing with words, something that deals with one material church, and that means the whole Church of Christ. This is a kind of thread going through these biographies, which means to me, someone wants to show us something theological. It wants to show us this little man from Assisi, who was called Poverello, the little poor, he was the one rescuing the church, which means all these stories are more kind of made up to make a theological argument than that they contain some historical remembrance in them. As a biographer, I would respect them as an understanding, as a theological interpretation of St. Francis. I would not include them in the story of the life of St. Francis. In these cases, so somehow you might say I skip out some legendary material, which I also do in some cases when I think about context plausibility of something. I will return to this story about the Sultan. I said already that this was taken very often as a symbol for peace between religions. Again, Pope Francis is someone who did so when he said peace is something that must be worked on every day. And to use a phrase that sounds like a contradiction, it must be fought for every day. It is necessary to combat every day for peace, not for war. It is necessary to sow gentleness, understanding, peace. And then he says, St. Francis prayed, Lord, make me an instrument of your peace. I would like to be an instrument of peace in Mexico. He was just visiting Mexico, but with all of you. So he's referring to a source ascribed to Francis, the famous song, Lord, make me an instrument of your peace. Where there is hatred, let me sow love. Where there is injury, pardon. Where there is doubt, faith. Where there is despair, hope, and so on. For it is in giving that we receive, and it's in pardoning that we are pardoned, and it's in dying that we are born to eternal life. Amen. What a wonderful song. And I would love it to be a song of Francis of Assisi. Unfortunately, it was first attested in 1912 in a French journal. That is not even about plausibility or likeliness. That is just a source problem. We think something has to do with Francis, which has not, and we make out of this ideas, which are good ideas about the peace of religions. If you look closer to Francis, I doubt if I can say he was cheering, he was favorizing peace between religions as we would do in our days. And here the theologian in me and the historian come into some of tension or battle, at least as a theologian. I would love him to be a propagator of peace of religions. As a historian, I have to say, when I said before he had a missionary sermon to the Sultan in the context of the Crusades, some years after the reconquest of Jerusalem by Sultan Saladin, and during the Fifth Crusade, led by Pope Honorius III, after the Sultan had given a peace offer, but the Christians had defeated, had lost the battle against the Muslims. And then he came into the camp as a missionary. Then he tried now to do without weapons what the Crusaders had tried to do with weapons. It is good to not to bear weapons, of course. So this is a peaceful element, but it is not a mission of now we accept the Islam, how I would say we should do nowadays as Christians, but it is more, I try to convert them to Christianity, if not with weapons, than with my words. That is not really peace of religions historically, if we put it into the historical context. So that's another way for a biographer to understand what Francis did. And then there is something to reconstruct his biography, and that became the most important to me when writing this biography. That is to look what is really an individual scene in his life, what shows in comparison to others something that is very particular to this Saint Francis. And here I return to what I said before, that his relation to his father was so important for him. There is a scene in his life. He was a merchant's son, and the father sent him out to sell things in a nearby city. He did so. He sold. He got a good income by selling fabrics, textures. He returned to Assisi, and then he felt something wrong about being a merchant. He brought all the money he had earned for his father to a church and left it there. Now imagine, how would you think about this as a father? We read this as a story of the saint. He did everything right. But the father, awaiting his son, bringing him back some money after selling goods, he was upset. Francis knew that he would hide a while, and then he would return, would face his father in front of the bishop, who was called by the father to be a judge about Pietro the father and Francis the son. And in this situation, Francis told his father, I don't want to have anything from you. Get your money back. He took it from the church, brought it back to the father, and he even stripped his clothes and threw them to his father. And there, as you see in this painting of Giotto, the bishop then turned clothes around him, that he was not really naked in this scene. But it is a very telling scene. Here, he abrogated anything he had from his being a merchant's son, and he converted to being some naked, following the naked Jesus, as he put it sometimes. And the one who helped him was the authority of the church. That is, I would say, the shifting moment in his life. He left his status as a rich merchant, and he became a follower of the church and a poor man, even more someone who solidarized with with the poor and the sick. So I understand his life very much out of a generation conflict in Assisi, including that he went to, as I said, the sick, as he wrote in his testament. This is how God inspired me, Brother Francis, to embark upon a life of penance. When I was in sin, the sight of lepers, so those lepers who were expelled from the city, who lived outside the city, the sight of those lepers nauseated me beyond measure. But then God himself led me into that company, and I had pity on them. When I had once become acquainted with them, what had previously nauseated me became a source of spiritual and physical consolation for me. After that, I did not wait long before leaving the world. So his way out of the world was going to the lepers, going to the sick, going to the poor. That was the shift in his life. He didn't want to be the rich heir of his father. He wanted to be the poor follower of Jesus Christ. And that's what I elaborate on in this book, Francis of Assisi, which I'm proud of and glad of that Yale University Press printed it now only a few weeks ago in English. And I'm glad that you came here to listen to me talking about this. And I will be happy to answer your questions and to have now the talk with Brennan, Professor Lee. Thank you very much for your attention.
Okay, thank you, Professor, for such an inspiring talk. Let's welcome Professor Li Qiuling from Renmin University of China.
首先感谢我们线上和线下的2位主持人，也感谢来宾教授在短短的半个小时的时间里，给我们介绍了方济各的伟大的人格和他传奇的人生。尽管他的人格和这个传奇的人生呢，有很多是建立在无法证实的传说之上，但是我们毕竟是从这里呢感受到了这个在世界文化史和宗教史上非常重要的人物。方济各的伟大可能很大程度上呢，跟他的时代是非常有关系的。也就是说，这是一个刚刚经历了十字军东征的时代。在这个时代里边呢，罗马教廷通过十字军东征获得了巨大的威望和这个财富、权力等等，但是也同时加快了罗马天主教的世俗化的过程。在这种情况下呢，使得罗马天主教呢遭到了那些虔诚的基督徒的这个批评。所以在这种意义上来说呢，如果这种批评走向极端，那么就会造成与罗马教廷的分裂，也就是说出现所谓的异端。这是方济各生活的时代面临的一个严重的问题。那么我想刚才由于这个雷平教授呢，只有半个小时的时间，所以做这个介绍呢，我们还不能完全这个去体会这个时代的这个情况啊。遗憾的是，我在这之前我不知道雷平教授的这本书呢是用德文写的啊。我们耶鲁中心呢，交给我的是你的英译本的部分。我看德文呢，可能要比这个看这个英文要方便得多所以这个我没有这个仔细认真的去读这个莱宾教授的这个著作，否则的话，我可能会有更深的这个体会。那么，我想，方济各这个人物在宗教史和这个世界文化史，他的 地位呢，当然如这个莱宾教授所介绍的那样，是这个在于他的这个伟大的人格，作为一个富商的儿子，他放弃了自己的忧郁的生活，而选择了苦修。这可以也是对罗马，天主教的那个世俗化的一种抗议啊。另外，他对这个弱者、对穷人的这个特殊的这种关照啊，呃，这都是这个在那个时代呢，是一种非常可贵的精神。尤其是我们在了解这个方济各的这个生平这方面呢，刚才赖平教授也这个提到了比如他对这个甚至这个对动物的这个特殊的关照当然我这个有一点我不大同意，人们现在所做的这个评价说这个方济各是这个什么这个。环境保护的这个先知我觉得这个可能是这个说的过分了一点儿，因为在方济各那个时代呢，环境保护这个思想呢，还基本上没有出现啊。我倒觉得方济各这方面呢，有点更像这个佛教的这个所提倡的那种这个众生平等的思想。而这在这个基督教这个传统中呢，应该是一个比较超前的思维方式所以可以说是这方面的一个先知，所以人们把它称之为这个动物的这个保护神，我觉得这还是比较恰当的说环境保护可能这个稍稍超前了一点。那么对于这个方济各来说呢，我想，我们中国或者说这个汉语文化圈呢，对方济各这个人物呢，确实了解的是比较有限啊，所以我想这个，赖平教授的这本书，如果这个能够翻译成中文呢，呃。可能会给我们这个带来很多这个新的知识和新的认识。那么，我们中国人虽然对这个方济各的了解有限，但是对方济各创办的这个修会也就是说方济各会，他的了解呢，却并不是很少。或者说陌生啊，如果说这个我们对这个西方的哲学史稍有了解的话，我们就会知道这个中世纪晚期，它的哲学史基本上是有这个方济各修会和这个多明我修会，这两个修会的这个神学家撰写的。这个当然了，我们还要知道这个多明我，这个修会它的创建，在一定意义上来说，也同样受到了方济各的影响，中世纪晚期著名的哲学家，例如这个伯纳文图拉，像这个邓斯斯科特。像这个威廉奥卡姆，都是这个方济各修会的这个成员。当然，这个时候呢，也有一个特别突出的这个现象，值得我们关注，那就是到了这个方济各之后这个时代呢，欧洲发生了一个重大的变化，那就是城市地位的恢复商业交往的这个出现，以及这个大学的产生等等。最初方济各倡导这个清贫传道， 这建立的修会叫做我们中文叫做这个托钵修会啊，就是或者说叫乞讨修会。但是由于城市的这个兴起呢，使得方济各会的这个关注的这个中心呢，转向了城市，转向了大学，使得这个晚期中世纪的这个大学呢，这个成为这个方济各会和这个多明我会啊，竞争的一个重要的阵地。所以在这种意义上来说呢，晚期这个中世纪的这些哲学史呢，在我们汉语文化圈里还是被大家所熟悉的啊。比如说像这个包纳温图拉啊，这是这个方济各会的第7任的总会长吧，啊，他的这个思想。可以说当时是跟这个托马斯·阿奎那并驾齐驱的，甚至可以说是竞争的。他的思想也同样引起了我们这个汉语文化圈的注意。比如说我知道的第一个博士生，他所做的这个博士学位论文，的主题就是包纳温图拉的思想，而这个邓斯科特和这个威廉奥卡姆的思想呢，也可以说在这个汉语文化圈里边受到广泛的关注啊。这相关的这个研究成果呀，也是这个很多的啊。所以在这个意义上来说呢，方济各修会来说，对我们中国人来说并不陌生啊。那么另一个方济各修会呢，引起我们这个关注呢，那就是这个方济各修会在这个基督教对华传播，这个过程中，所起的这个重要作用。我们知道这个基督教，这个尤其是这个我们现在说天主教，啊。在中华的传播呢，是在明末清初，这个时代，最早在中国传播的呢，是这个耶稣会的，修士。那么对于耶稣会来说呢，它这个在欧洲它的产生呢，实际和方济各会呢完全走的是两个方向，啊。因为方济各会呢，由于方济各本人的这种思想倾向，那就是关注贫穷、关注穷人，所以他一开始呢，就是这个向这个穷人布道，而耶稣会呢，一开始走的就是这个精英路线。他这个注重的是在这个城市啊，在这个大学啊，在宫廷啊，这些地方去这个，发挥自己的影响力。所以这个耶稣会到了中国之后呢，他首先关注的是中国的士大夫阶层，也就是说这个儒家的这个读书人和这个官员等等这些人物。而这个耶稣会取得成功之后呢，方济各修会也来到中国传教，但是方济各会呢，就更多的继承他自己这个清贫传教的这个传统。到了这个中国之后呢，方济各修会的传教士呢，是一头扎进了中国的农村，甚至进了这个山沟里。所以在这种意义上来说呢，方济各修会和耶稣会对中国文化的理解呢，就产生了巨大的差异啊。这样在这个中国这个在清代就产生了这个所谓的中国礼仪之争，这样一个重大的事件。 它在这个基督教对华传播史中呢，是一个非常重要的这个事件。相对来说呢，与这个耶稣会，向这个中国文化采取了一种适应的措施不同，方济各会呢，更多的是坚持信仰的这个纯正性，啊，对中国文化呢，更多的采取了批评的态度。所以在这种意义上来说呢，随之而来的这个中国的禁教就是这个禁止基督教的传播对于这个方济各会在中国的这个传教来说，是打击比较严重的，而且甚至到了这个中国鸦片战争之后呢，呃，虽然这个终止了这个禁教的这个做法，但是方济各会呢，在中国的这个发展呢，并没有什么这个新的起色。但是即便是这样我们这个汉语文化圈呢，也没有忘记方济各会在这个中国的传播过程中呢，对于中国的这个一风一俗，对于中国的这个现代化的这个努力所做出的这个贡献这方面呢，我们这个在这个研究中国的这个近代史的这个过程中呢，是有那个很多这个肯定性的强调的。所以在这个意义上来说呢，虽然我们对方济各个人他的了解是这个有限的我也希望我们这个雷平教授这部著作呢，能够对我们这个中国在这方面的发展呢，能够起到这个积极的作用但是对于这个方济各所建立的这个修会以及他确立的这样一个宗教传统啊，中国人还是这个不陌生的啊，我们还是希望在这方面呢，能够加强我们的研究不知道赖平教授能够给我们提出这个什么好的建议谢谢，我就说这么多吧。
感谢李教授为我们提供了方济各以及他建立的修会方济各会在中世纪的这样的一个哲学方面的影响的介绍，以及方济各会对中国的这个基督教的传播起到的作用。那么，so Professor Leppin, do you have any comments on Professor Lee's talk?
Yeah, first of all, thank you very much. And wir könnten Deutsch miteinander reden. Vielen Dank. Ich freue mich sehr, darüber jemanden zu treffen, der die deutsche Kultur so gut kennt. But I switch to English, of course, for our audience. So thank you so much for your deep insights. What I learned the most is to really put this understanding of Francis into a broader religious context when it comes to our environmental culture. I totally agree that he's not a kind of environmental protector as we need in our days, and maybe Christians can learn a lot of from the Buddhist culture, as you showed. So that's a true deep insight. I will respond to two aspects you raised. The one, and I'm very grateful for this, that you pointed to the importance of Francis for philosophy and theology in the Middle Ages. Just to take one example of those you mentioned, among others, you mentioned William of Ockham, who actually, as one German researcher, Jürgen Mietke, put it, chose his Franciscan option when he came into conflict with the Pope of his time. He evolved a Franciscan image of the church, saying we have to follow the Franciscan call, which leads us back to the primitive church as a church, as he then put it, of simplicity and poverty. So here we have a deep influence of Francis on philosophy and theology, of course, and we could, well, of course, you mentioned Bonaventure from the philosophical side. I mentioned him from his side as a biographer. So he's another figure where we can see how Franciscan thoughts came into the picture in this time, as you mentioned, of founding universities. And to take another point you made, I again have to say I have to learn so much about missionaries in Chinese culture. But as far as I understand, indeed we can describe the difference between those Jesuit missionaries you mentioned and Francis' encounter with the Sultan. When we look at those Jesuits who took up elements of Chinese culture, who even sported clothes of the Chinese culture to show we are close to you. That's indeed a kind of different way of mission than we encountered with Francis entering the camp and holding just a missionary sermon. So there is a lot to do about comparison between these different cultures. And as you said, then there was also a Franciscan missionary in China. So we might learn, coming from this figure of St. Francis, a lot about cultural and religious encounter between Europe and China. And I'm eager to learn a lot about this. Thank you so much.
李教授，请问您还有什么需要补充的吗？针对刚刚 Leppin 教授的一些回应。
我想这个，关于Leppin教授提到这个方济各这种这个传教方式来说呢，实际方济各有一个非常明确的，这个思想，那就是说要回到使徒时代，的那种这个那个传教方式。我们知道这个耶稣当年所带领的这个团队呢，就是说里边这个富贵的人是很缺乏的啊。耶稣的这个早期弟子呢，基本上都是这个属于这个穷人，或者说这个在社会上没有什么这个地位的人。那么这个方济各呢，在面临这个我刚才说了，面临这个十字军东征之后，这个罗马教廷的发展，这个他认为这个教会呢，已经完全在向这个世俗化的方向发展，所以在这种意义上来说呢，方济各是要这个把他拉回到这个早期的使徒时代的这种传教方式。如果我们想一想，这个在此后的这个马丁路德所发动这个宗教改革，以及加尔文所发动这个宗教改革，那么在很大程度上呢，他们与方济各的这个思想啊，可以说是一脉相承的。啊，而我刚才说这个，对我们中国这个文化圈来说呢，可能对方济各的了解不是那么充分，但是这个马丁路德和加尔文的思想呢，在汉语文化圈里是可以说是非常熟悉的，所以在某种意义上，我们可以说，我们在间接的。了解了这个方济各的这个思想。当然，这里边呢有一个问题，那就是说，在我们这个汉语这个圈子里边呢，由于这个基督新教，并不认这个方济各为他们的这个神学祖先。 而这个天主教这方面呢，对方济各同样没有这个太多的这个了解。你知道，我刚才说了，中国的这个天主教呢，在很大程度上早期是这个耶稣会占这个主要这个地位。后来呢，像这个巴黎外方传教会呢，是占这个主要地位，所以这个方济各会呢，在一定的意义上来说，在中国，传教这个意义上来说，它的地位并不是很重要啊，所以这就影响到对方济各的这个了解了。